Hey friends, and welcome back to the Rewind podcast of Forward Church. Join us each week as we take a look back on Sunday's message and dig a little deeper into the conversations with those who are teaching across our sites at Forward. We want to invite you to be part of the conversation too. So if something we're talking about on Sunday morning sparks a question in you, head to our website, forwardchurch.ca/ask-us, and submit your questions there. And we're going to do our best to engage with those questions in this space. With that said, let's jump in and get started.
All right, and welcome back to the Rewind podcast. And we have from our Kitchener site teaching this past week was Derek Fuller, our Kitchener site pastor.
Hello. And can I say, Andrew, how much better Rachel's intro is than yours was?
You can say it, but it's still not right.
He's getting all misty-eyed.
Cut a little deeper than it should have. And for the very first time on the Rewind podcast, our pastor of Church Life, Kevin Pent. So I'd love for you to give us a sense of what the pastor of Church Life does, what's your role here, and then give us something interesting about yourself.
Well, I don't know if there's anything interesting. We shall see. But I am excited to be here for one. This is my debut, I guess you could say. Church Life pastor. I would say, in essence, I oversee everything adult for the most part. Right. Life groups, alpha, men's, women's ministry, etc.
Okay.
And something interesting, at the end of a work day, typically, the way I unwind is in the kitchen cooking dinner. So I don't know if that's interesting, mundane, or just really weird, but there it is.
No, and we're going to be heading over to your place for dinner tonight.
You are invited.
And if you listen to Derek's sermon at all, it better be burritos like that.
Well, I gathered that, and that's really the essence of what I took away from Derek's sermon.
Right, so. Yes, there's multiple burrito evidence.
I haven't had lunch yet either, so let's keep food talk to a minimum, please.
All right, so this past week we had this conversation about how, when it feels like things are chaotic and we can't figure out really, who's in charge here. Either it feels like no one's in charge, or it feels like the person in charge is untrustworthy, or, would be in disobedience or in opposition to God's design. How do we handle that as followers of Jesus? So like right in line with the upstream sort of thinking. I'm going to start with you, Kevin. You sort of took it in a direction I wasn't expecting. You said, I hope when you walk away, you can lay down your burdens and sins. So tell me how you built that bridge between God's in control of who's in control and our own ability to lay down our sins and burdens.
Well, without recounting the entire sermon, because it was not where I expected to land, actually. My question was, in just looking at the sermon title, God is in control of who is in control, one thing I pointed out is that we would all agree that no one is in control. So the question is God in control? Do I believe that? And if God is in control, if I believe that, then what relevance does that have to me? And that's where I think we need to dig down into the life of Daniel. And one of the things that struck me is that Daniel's response in the midst of a life-threatening situation is absolutely remarkable. There's no other explanation than the grace of God. And so somehow Daniel was positioned such that when Arioch was coming his way to take he and his companions' lives, Daniel had the wherewithal to answer with discretion and prudence, with a level head, and then do the next thing. And so as I thought about the people coming into Forward, I thought, all of us, or I would say the vast majority of us would say yes to the question, is God in control? Then if God is in full control, then what relevance does that have to my life? And can I, in fact, be positioned to respond as Daniel did in all of life's circumstances? And certainly there can be very few circumstances that I think are more dire than what Daniel faced, and he responded in an amazing way. So if that's the case, if we can actually say God is in control, and somehow, by the grace of God, I can respond to life circumstances as Daniel did, that means then whatever I'm carrying today, I don't have to leave with.
Yeah.
And so my challenge was, don't leave with it. Lay it down,
Mm-hmm.
walk away. Now, easier said than done, but we'll unpack that a little bit.
Yeah. So, Derek, for you on the Kitchener side, you attack this from a wildly different angle. So if someone walked in Kitchener and then left with something in their hands, what are you hoping that was?
Yeah. So, I mean, it was right in the title. God is in control of who's in control. And then we see that this plays out, that God is working through human history to accomplish his purposes, and his purposes will not fail. And it culminates in the person of Jesus. And so, you know, when I came to the end, what I wanted people to see as they walk through this story and then this dream and vision is that ultimately this is all about Jesus in the end.
Mm-hmm.
God is working out this plan. And what we see at the end of that vision is that anything that isn't founded on Jesus collapses and crumbles.
Yeah.
And so what does that mean for our lives and how we build the foundation of our lives?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I love the different angles, but same sort of accents and emphases that you guys carried through the conversation. Both of you guys talked a little about sovereignty and control. And I couldn't help but think, as we look at the character of Nebuchadnezzar, and he's starting to freak out a little bit. I believe you called him a toddler throwing a tantrum.
Yep.
If I'm not mistaken there.
If you have toddlers, man, you recognize Nebuchadnezzar. It's like, give your toddler all the power to decide who lives and who dies in a moment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you have with Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah. And very much on display, and sort of a recurring theme in the book of Daniel, right? He's just constantly losing his mind on things.
We'll see it again next week.
Yep. I was just doing my prep because I'm up next week. What I couldn't help but think is, I think for those of us who are feeling this upstream against the current sort of life, what we're feeling is a loss of control, that the power of Christendom and the church has been removed slowly over the last number of years. And some people respond like a toddler throwing a tantrum from the church. Would you agree, disagree, and how would you pastorally, we'll start with you, Derek, how would you respond to someone who said, like, I'm freaking out, I'm losing my control here, and they're responding poorly? How would you as a pastor want to guide and shepherd them in that moment?
Yeah, so let me first give the benefit of the doubt to a lot of people who find themselves in that spot, that there is legitimate concern, because what we honestly and truly believe as Christians is that when we do things God's way, it's what works best in the end, right? So I think within some of this, there's legitimate concern as we see society going in a direction, walking away from God. There is legitimate other-centered concern for what we see taking place in our culture, right? But that can also become, we can start to believe that that's the only thing that's going on, that all we have is concern, and we don't stop and look and ask the question of ourselves, at least, is my concern primarily for the people around me, or is it a sense of losing my place of power and privilege as a Christian?
Right.
And I think we have to have some honest dialogue. I can't tell you what your motives are, but you have to have that discussion to say, why am I really so angry?
Right.
Why am I really so fearful?
Yeah.
Right? Why does what is happening in culture, why does that cause such a panic inside me? Is it really a concern for other people, or is it a concern for something that I feel I am losing, that I am owed?
Right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that my obedience has gifted me this position, that God owes me, things are going the right way, we're going to turn things around here and head in the right direction.
Yeah.
So Kevin, I'll pick on you here.
Yeah.
The sermon title itself lends itself to some questions that are not easily answered. So when we look at, a tyrannical tantrum-throwing leader in Nebuchadnezzar, we can look back through the pages of history and see that those sorts of things have happened over and over. So God is in control of who's in control, but then there's things that happen. I believe it was you who said that, like, it feels like no one's in control sometimes. Like there's genocide and mass hysteria and all these things. You look through things like Holocaust and you look around the globe. how do you, again, pastorally, leading your people, how do you coach someone through that moment of saying like, hey, God is in control of who's in control, even when it looks like no one's in control?
Yeah. Wow. The take on that question's, of course, $1 million question, really. And that is, I guess the thing that I pointed out was that no one is in control. And when we think we're in control, we're ultimately not. So what we see spinning out of control around us is the nature of how things are apart from God.
Mm-hmm.
And what we don't see is God's invisible hand working the course of history, at the same time providentially allowing people to make decisions and consequences that result as an outcome of those decisions. And so I just lost that question there.
There you
so
go.
I'm just going to be really open. Can you?
So the question on the table is, what do we do with that fact that if we believe that God is sovereign, but sometimes it doesn't look or feel or seem like it at all?
Yeah.
So how do I, as a follower of Jesus in 2020, look around and see things that feel like they're, flying out the window of a moving car, or you look back at people who've walked through horrible experiences like genocide or the Holocaust, and how do you say to someone with any level of confidence that God was sovereignly over that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's the question.
Yeah, and why didn't he intercede?
Right.
Yeah,
if God is sovereign, why didn't he do something about that? Why did he allow those things to happen?
Yeah. Well, I think, we can look back at what Derek said, and one of the things that I pointed out in my sermon, that is the fact that all of history culminates in Jesus Christ. And he is, he has come, he has redeemed humankind. And I think that is the good news that we have to point to. I mean, I think, and this is one of the things that I pointed out to some of my leaders recently, and I know, Derek, we've been in conversation about that, and that is we can easily lose heart or lose faith when we look at the world around us and try to figure out the mind of God. Because we simply cannot know why these things are happening. But the question remains, do I trust the character of God? Do I trust the fact that God is perfectly loving, he's perfectly just, and he's sovereign, and he's in control, and that he is going to work all things out for his glory in the end, and he's redeeming his people, and that's the good news that we have to point to. So I think we have to, one, look at the character of God, and not try to figure out the mind of God. We have to believe that all history points to Jesus Christ, and then we need to, as Christ followers, point people to the Savior.
Yeah.
And this might be an overused example, but I mean, it's from Scripture, right? Peter's walking on the water, and what is it that causes him to sink? He takes his eyes off of Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think that is a very real, living example of how we are to live our lives. We have to continually point people to Jesus.
And I'll just jump off of Kevin there, because I think that he brings it to the right point, which is Jesus, right?
Right.
So where is God in all of this? Well, he's working out a plan where he enters into all of it. That's the incarnation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then he takes on all of it on the cross. He offers a solution to the problem of evil where he actually takes all evil upon himself, even though he didn't. There was nothing that would force his hand to do that other than his very character of his ununderstandable in many ways love for us, right?
Well, and I like how you pointed out in your message, Derek, where the astrologers and magicians in final response to Nebuchadnezzar say, you're asking us to do something that no one has ever asked anyone before, and only the gods who are not on this earth, but are in the heavens could answer that. And you pointed out the fact that Jesus, God incarnate, came to earth.
Yeah.
And I thought that was an insightful way to approach that. And you are absolutely right in that Christ can identify fully with human suffering, but has defeated that.
And we're also going to have somebody who's going to come on
Yeah.
our bonus podcast here.
Yeah. A little teaser.
So I don't want to take up too much of this question, because I know Dr. Fowler from Heritage Theological Seminary, he's going to deal with some of these issues of free will and election and how culpable
Suffering.
is God in suffering that takes place. But let's not forget that at its core, sin is us wanting to wrestle control from God.
Yeah.
And then God allows humanity to take control, and then we wonder why doesn't he take control back?
Right.
Right?
Yeah. And that's why I think it's helpful for us. Like, I think, as followers of Jesus sitting in a pew on a Sunday morning, we want to put ourselves in Daniel's shoes.
Yeah.
Like, that's sort of where we want to be. But I think more often than not, we're the astrologers who are freaking out, or we're the Nebuchadnezzar in the narrative rather than the Daniel. Some would say that there's a type of Christ in Daniel, that there's that. And I love that what you guys are talking about ultimately comes to fruition in that prophecy, right? That, God sovereignly looked ahead and said, these things are going to happen, but we can look ahead and see that there's going to be a stone not cut by human hands who's going to smash all this to bits and it's going to fade away like nothing.
Yeah.
So the hope of Jesus is ultimately how we can handle this, but we got to hold tight to that hope and some times where it feels like things are chaotic.
Absolutely.
You guys both came at the conversation of integrity and character, which I thought was really helpful. That's sort of been, for you, Derek, that's been a thread that's been woven through the past few weeks, and I've really appreciated, Kevin, how you attacked that. I wanted to say, like, for someone who deeply believes in Jesus and understands that our morality, our foundation, and our relationship with Jesus is found on his morality, not on ours. But to ask the question, is integrity, character different than morality? And part two, is it more important in an exile experience to live with integrity?
Are you asking
Yeah.
a particular one of us?
Yeah, we'll go with you, Derek, because Kevin was on a bunch of that. So is integrity and character more important in an exile experience as an opening?
I think that what not being in power, what having a view of kind of being a minority and a majority, what it forces you to do is ultimately it will reveal integrity and character.
Okay.
So I don't know that I wouldn't say it's more important. I would say that it becomes revealed because if you live by the societal norms, you won't be living
Right.
in congruency with the teachings of Jesus.
Right.
So we can look back maybe 50 years and say there was a number of societal norms that were common to the entirety of the culture that were also common to Christianity that now no longer exist, right?
Yeah, Judeo-Christian values were a norm and not necessarily the case anymore.
And so it refines, right? It reveals what is actually true there. Were you living by those convictions because they were your convictions that this is who Christ calls us to be, or were you doing it because it was convenient, because that's what everybody in the culture lived by?
Yeah, and that's the whole idea of this upstream thinking, right? And Kevin, you mentioned in your sermon how the danger of anonymity when it comes to living out of integrity, right? That I just couldn't help but think in an internet age, our character and integrity can be diminished because anonymity is everywhere. I can do things. I can, ghost Twitter accounts and all those sorts of things that I can do whatever I want, and people don't have to see that. How would you, again, pastorally digging into that, how do we counsel people to live outside of the anonymity that's so clearly and quickly available to them?
Well, I think anonymity begins in the mind. I think we have to realize that. I mean, technology certainly offers a degree of anonymity, although sometimes I think I'm not so sure that's true because of, the way that our fingerprints get left on the technology.
Yeah.
And,
You just ask kids applying for colleges these days.
Yeah, exactly. So, but anonymity begins in the mind. And I think of the verse, as a person thinks in their heart, so are they.
Yep.
And so that is what reveals the character. And so what we need to be aware of is when I talk about the ease of anonymity, it's the ease with which we sin internally. No one else knows except God.
Right.
And when those things are left unchecked, then they begin to manifest themselves in ugly outward ways.
Yeah.
You know, in our speech, in our relationships with others, in our actions and whatnot. So my point then was Daniel resolved in his heart. And again, the Hebrew word for resolved or purposed is upon the heart, which I thought, that's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it began in the heart. He resolved beforehand that he was going to honor God no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
There was no big or small in it, you know.
Yeah.
And so it was from that's why I thought, you know, as I looked at chapter 2, I thought we have to kind of glance back at chapter 1 where it all began.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we'll see Daniel as unrelatable or absolutely mind-blowingly extraordinary.
Yep.
And again, it stems back to his rootedness in God and integrity that stemmed from a heart resolve that I'm going to plant my stake here, and you know, that's where I'm going to.
Yep. And that's what we're going to see through the whole book.
Yeah.
We're going to see it next week. We're going to see it with Daniel in the Lion's Den, obviously, is just this, resolve that started right when he was a teenager. Right? And I love the fact that it starts as a young man.
Absolutely.
And when we get to Daniel in Daniel chapter 6, he's an old man.
Yeah.
But he's lived this life of consistency, of integrity. And integrity is living in congruence. So you can be a bad person, right? You can have low character and live a life of integrity.
Yeah.
Because you're living as a person who is integrated. Like I've got low morals. I don't have a moral compass, and I live accordingly.
Yeah.
Right? That's what I'm just living an integrated life. What I say I believe works itself out in how I live and act. That's what integrity means. Sometimes we mix up those two words, integrity and character. They're different words.
Yeah. That's helpful to pull those two things apart. Yeah, and I think this is a direct quote from you because I wrote it down in my notes, but you said small decisions determine character. And I think that's just what we see, like you said, Derek, through this whole narrative is that, you know, from I'm not going to eat the wine and meat that's provided to me all the way up to I'm going to stand in defiance against asking me to not pray to my God, right? Like that, there's all those things in between that we want to be able to get to that point, but it's a lot of small steps walked faithfully to get there. And Derek, I thought it was really helpful that you pointed out to get the crew before the crisis, and that there's this community aspect that sometimes we want to, you know, almost deify Daniel and be like, oh, he's this perfect example of what it means to live a life of wholeness and character. But like, he had some people around him who were deeply helpful in this process.
He did, and I said on Sunday, I frequently, and Kevin, you probably do too, I have people come to me when they're in crisis and they need people around them. And that's nice. Like, I think it's a good, you know, I think that's our natural inclination to bring people around us when we're in crisis. That's when we recognize, hey, I can't do this on my own. But you should know ahead of time, you can't do this on your own.
Right.
And you need to get that crew before you hit the crisis, because you have to build community. You can't microwave that. And I think we, in an instant culture, we think everything should happen like that, right? But relationship takes both experiences shared, that takes time, and then time spent together in proximity, right?
Yeah.
That's what creates relationship. And we have we have a crisis of relationship right now. Everybody says, I feel disconnected, I feel lonely, I don't have a relationship. You are going to feel that way unless you prioritize, unless you resolve yourself ahead of time to be in community. And the only way that I know, like to stand firm in crisis is to have other people around me. Even Jesus, when he's there in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? He brings his closest friends in with. Now they let him down. They
Maybe you want a better community than that.
The best crew to be praying for him. But even Jesus, in his humanity, needed other people around him as he sat there at this crisis moment. Right? Why on earth would we think that we're stronger and we're better at this than Jesus?
Right.
Yeah, I think the most effective pastoral care is community.
Yeah.
You know, and like you say, if we live in isolation, then when the wheels come off, then, you know, there's that sense of desperation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say for us, like if we're speaking organizationally as a church, that's a high value that we want to hold up, is like get serving with people shoulder to shoulder, or jump into a life group so that you have the community who can hold you up and keep you together. And I think as we think through this upstream sort of mindset, like there is like a hyper individualistic mindset that like I can do this on my own. I just put my shoulder, I just like Jason Statham my way through life. I'm just going to like grab something and kick somebody else through a door. And you can't do life with Jesus faithfully like that.
No.
Yeah. I think there's another danger that we've fallen to, and we've fallen into in some ways in church circles too. And that's on the other side, which is that community is somehow the end goal. No, community is a vehicle by which God develops Christ-like character in us.
Right.
It's the vehicle in which this takes place. It is not just, well, I'm in community, so I should, I've got it solved. We used to believe that content was the end goal.
Right.
Right? We would just, if we could just pump people full of enough content, then that would be what made them a mature believer.
That's still my default setting that I have to
ultimately, what we have to get to is character and calling, right? And community is a vehicle for us to discover calling and to be, grown in our character.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Kevin, you closed off your sermon with a couple of like absolute knock it out of the park, great questions. What insurmountable, you picked big words and I'm not that smart. So insurmountable obstacle is God calling you to confront in faith. What's your Babylon? What's the ordinary mundane where God is calling me to be faithful? And like, I love the juxtaposition of like, what's this insurmountable obstacle and where's the like mundane everyday faithfulness? Because in the life of Daniel, we see both of those things. So I'd love your mindset in those questions, and there's any sort of like final words that you'd want to say to people as they wrestle those questions now midweek to the ground, asking those questions. What would you want them to be processing in that moment?
Yeah, I think there's the tendency to read the book of Daniel and to see these stories that many of us grew up recounting as kids, right? And these were great stories and, great men and women of faith. And so as I looked at this chapter, I was thinking about, okay, it's very clear what Daniel's seemingly insurmountable obstacle is. It's the death threat, right?
Yep.
And God called him to intercede, and in that sense, we see him very much as a Jesus figure, right? But for us to be able to identify with Daniel, we may never experience that death threat. And it's irrelevant whether we do or don't. But we are faced with obstacles. And often they seem insurmountable. And so if they are there for a purpose, a reason, which if we believe that God is sovereign, then in fact they are there for a reason, then the next question is, how would God have us to respond in this? And so if my obstacle is, and I pointed this out, a loved one that seems to be far from God, am I going to pray in faith or am I going to simply doubt? If I have a job that is, I'm pulling my hair out, is God calling me just to survive, or can I thrive within maybe what's a caustic or hostile environment, and on from, chronic pain to, to marital conflict, whatever that is. God has allowed that. And so how are we going to respond in faith? But then on the other end of the spectrum, we have to realize, and this is what I pointed out, is that the last verse of chapter 1 simply states something to the effect that Daniel was at the king's court until right through the reign of Cyrus.
Yep.
And what that means then is that he was there for decades, probably 65 plus years. And so what we see captured in the book of Daniel are snapshots of things, significant snapshots of things that happened over the course of 65 to 70 years. But there's the absence, there's the gaps, there's the day-to-day things that we don't have a window into. Yet when a crisis comes, Daniel responds in a godly way, which would suggest that during those gaps, he was faithful. And so to me, I thought, wow, what an opportunity for us to consider that in the seemingly mundane of our lives that don't seem to make for great stories,
Right.
God is saying, why don't you live above that? Because, I mean, look around you at the wonder, at the miracle of life, and at the miracle of redemption, new life. And why don't we see all of this as God ordained, God orchestrated, and to live into that? What an exciting calling. So I think we need to sometimes remove the calluses from our eyes. I speak for myself.
Yeah.
And say, how about live into that sense of wonder that God is calling us to? That really was the original creation intention anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love just thinking, because I do student ministry, from a student ministry lens, like our young people love the snapshot, like the big highlight reel moments. That's why Instagram is a thing still, right? But there's that obedience to the faithful obedience, like what's Eugene Peterson's quote there?
A long obedience in the same direction.
Yeah, like that's what all those snapshots are built off of. We want the highlight reels, but we got to be in the film room too.
Yeah,
well, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, if for anyone who is involved in sports, like that's the reality for sports, right? You see the highlight moment on the highlight reel, but you don't see the hours and hours and hours in basketball of shooting free throws at the line, 300 free throws every night, right? What you see is at the end in that clutch moment when it's to win the big game, they're able to sink it. Yeah. But it takes all of the work in behind to make it happen.
Yeah. Is this just you trying to turn the knife on me as a Leafs fan, and you as a Raptors fan? You're going to go Kawhi Leonard on me there?
I went to a Raptors game on Friday, and it was not it was bad. It was bad.
I'm sorry, my friend. I get it.
Well, you more than get it as a Leafs fan. I know. There wasn't Zamboni driver bad.
Okay,
it was just bad.
That was unnecessary. So we'll silence Derek's mic and Kev, get you. Is there any resources that you like to send our people out here with as we sort of wrap up? I thought that was a great note to end on. Anything that you want to send our people home with?
Well, the question was any resources I'd recommend. I mean, there were two books that came to mind, and they're not for everyone, but to me, they're like deeply nourishing. One of them was written 100 years ago by G.K. Chesterton called Orthodoxy, and the other was written in 1999 by Michael Frost called Seeing God in the Ordinary. And I think both of them overlap thematically in the sense of recapturing the wonder of the ordinary. But they do it differently. Frost looks at it more in terms of art, media, nature, the world around us, the creativity around us, and recognizing that God is not just transcendent. Okay, so the tendency is to look at God as sovereign and say, well, there's this transcendent God, which we really can't relate to because we're not transcendent. But yet God is immanent. God is here. God is with us.
Yeah.
And there is magic, for lack of a better word, in the world around us. And so we need to capture the wonderstruckness of a 2-year-old.
Yeah.
You know, when you're hanging out with a 1.5, 2-year-old and everything strikes their wonder chord, right?
Yeah.
And we need to look at that and say, that's what God intends. He didn't intend us to become adults and become somewhat cynical and jaded. No. He wants us to maintain that sense of wonder. So then I quoted in my sermon a line from G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy. And what he does is he captures that sense of wonder that is not lost on God, and that is not lost on children. And of course, in a Chestertonian way, he conveys it in such a winsome way that just kind of makes you see the world in a different light. But they're books I would recommend. If you're going to read them slowly and just take your time.
All right. Derek, a final word here from you as well.
Yeah, well, I'm sitting here with our church life pastor who oversees our groups ministries. And can I just give a plug that if you are not in Christian community, we deeply desire for you to be in Christian community, and we want to help you in that. So Kevin P. at forwardchurch.ca.
I did not pay Derek to say this.
No, but
I just watched him slide
but this is, I mean, we just really believe in the importance of this. Again, not as the end goal. I just want to state that you aren't, you don't become a Christian just because you got into community, but that being in community helps form us into the types of Christians who can live upstream lives. Absolutely. And so let us help you do that if you're not already in community.
That's
Wonderful.
right.
That's a great note for us to wrap up here on the Rewind podcast. And again, encourage you, if there's stuff that you're still processing from Sunday, we'd love to hear from you guys. forwardchurch.ca/ask us. And we want your questions here. We don't want this to be a one-way didactic preaching, but we want this to be an interaction between us and you guys. So thanks again for joining us, and we will see you next week.
Thanks a lot.